Let's run through some running back room notes for fantasy football from week 10. Eno Benjamin is now out of Arizona, and with the Houston Texans, James Conner had 24 touches in a great fantasy week. Atlanta running backs all had in common that they all scored under 4 fantasy points. Another decent Devin Singletary week. He had 14.7 fantasy points. Nyheim Hines is not really playing over there. Massive 31 touches for Deonta Foreman and 19 fantasy points. Khalil Herbert in Chicago had the better fantasy day, but not by much. They both were pretty bad between him and David Montgomery. Herbert does hit the IR now, though. Nick Chubb doubled Kareem Hunt's touches, 14.1 fantasy points. Is probably under his expectations. With no Zeke, Tony Pollard had a healthy 25 touches and a solid 21.8 fantasy points. Melvin Gordon in Denver had the highest snap percentage and had the most fantasy points, but did not lead the room in touches. Justin Jackson only had one less touch than DeAndre Swift, but Jamal Williams for Detroit led the way with 16 total. 26 touches and 70% of the snaps for Aaron Jones in Green Bay, 22.6 fantasy points. You still can't play A.J. Dillon. Dameon Pierce had 19 touches for the Texans, not really sharing much work with Burkhead over there. Signs of Jonathan Taylor being Jonathan Taylor from last season, 24 touches, 24.3 fantasy points. Slow day at the office for Travis Etienne for the Jaguars, 14 touches, iffy fantasy day. I didn't list CEH for Kansas City. He only played 4 snaps. McKinnon had 7 touches, but the best fantasy day. Isaiah Pacheco had a season-high 16 touches. Slower day at the office for Austin Eckler, 13 touches, and Isaiah Spiller over in Los Angeles is getting a little bit more work. Darrell Henderson led the way with 7 touches. Kyren Williams was back in the mix for the Rams. Workhorse touches, workhorse fantasy points for Josh Jacobs. We had 3 guys in Miami for the running back room have pretty good fantasy days, but Jeff Wilson led the room in touches again. 17 touches and 23.6 fantasy points for Dalvin Cook. For the Saints, only 11 for Alvin Kamara. Barkley had a huge 36-touch game, 23 fantasy points. The Eagles took their first L chasing the Commanders, so they didn't use Miles Sanders as much. Najee Harris had 20 total touches, but still didn't score as many fantasy points as Jaylen Warren for the Steelers. Ken Walker had 16 touches. What's interesting about this is that no other running back in Seattle had a touch. Christian McCaffrey and Elijah Mitchell both had very, very similar work. Kind of interesting moving forward for that. Leonard Fournette got banged up in this one, but Rachaad White opened up the game as a starter and had 22 touches. Typical Derrick Henry 20-plus workload, but not a typical Derrick Henry fantasy point week. Tons of work for Brian Robinson, 26 total touches. Antonio Gibson was still more fantasy efficient, though, in this one.